10:25 in the morning on October 16, 1962, CIA analysts spread aerial reconnaissance photographs across the table in the cabinet room of the White House showing Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba that would bring nuclear weapons capable of reaching Washington, D.C. in 13 minutes to a location just 90 miles from the Florida coast. President John F. Kennedy, who had been briefed moments earlier while still in his bedroom wearing pajamas and a bathrobe, studied the images with growing alarm as analysts pointed out launch pads, erector structures, fuel tanks, and missile transporters that left no doubt about Soviet intentions to deploy medium-range ballistic missiles that could kill millions of Americans before any defense could respond. The discovery triggered 13 days of escalating crisis that brought the world closer to nuclear annihilation than at any moment before or since, as Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev engaged in a dangerous game where miscalculation by either side could trigger a war that would destroy human civilization within hours. The crisis emerged from Cold War tensions that had transformed Cuba from American playground into communist outpost just 90 miles from Florida, creating a situation where the Soviet Union saw opportunity to achieve nuclear parity with the United States by placing missiles in America's backyard. Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959 had shocked American officials who treated Cuba as a colonial possession, and his subsequent nationalization of American properties and turn toward the Soviet Union for protection created conditions where Khrushchev could propose deploying nuclear missiles to defend his new ally while addressing the strategic imbalance that favored the United States. Kennedy's disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, when CIA-trained Cuban exiles were surrounded and forced to surrender within 3 days after Kennedy refused to provide air support, had convinced Castro and Khrushchev that another American invasion was inevitable. Khrushchev, who had developed genuine affection for Castro, decided in spring 1962 to deploy medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles to Cuba in complete secrecy, planning to announce a formal defense treaty once the missiles were operational. The Soviet deployment to Cuba, beginning in July 1962, required extraordinary secrecy as thousands of soldiers and missile components crossed the Atlantic on cargo ships where troops were crammed below decks with orders to wear civilian clothes upon arrival. 4 Soviet submarines accompanied the transport ships, each carrying a nuclear-tipped torpedo, with crews suffering through tropical heat that raised temperatures to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, while sailors collapsed from heat exhaustion. The deception worked through summer as American intelligence detected increased Soviet activity, but assumed the weapons were defensive anti-aircraft missiles rather than offensive nuclear weapons. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane, piloted by Major Richard Heiser, flew over western Cuba, photographing an area near San Cristobal that showed unmistakable signs of medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction. CIA photo interpreters working through the night analyzed the images, identifying launch pads, erector structures, fuel storage tanks, and other components that left no doubt the Soviets were installing offensive nuclear weapons 90 miles from Florida. Kennedy and his closest advisors formed the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as EXCOM, to debate response options in secret sessions where the president could hear competing arguments without committing publicly to any course of action. The initial debates on October 16th and 17th revealed deep divisions as military commanders led by Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay argued for immediate airstrikes to destroy the missile sites before they became operational, while others, including Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, advocated for a naval blockade that would prevent further Soviet shipments while creating time for diplomatic resolution. Kennedy listened as advisors argued that airstrikes could not guarantee destroying all missiles, that any attack on Cuba might trigger Soviet retaliation in Berlin or Turkey, where American missiles were equally vulnerable, and that a blockade would demonstrate American resolve while avoiding the immediate casualties that bombing would produce. The president made his decision on October 20th, choosing the blockade option that would be called a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of the word blockade, which under international law constituted an act of war, while ordering American forces to DEFCON 3 alert status and assembling an invasion force of more than 120,000 troops in Florida in case military action became necessary. Kennedy scheduled a televised address for October 22nd to announce the crisis to the American people and the world, knowing that once he spoke publicly, the confrontation would become a test of wills where neither he nor Khrushchev could back down without appearing weak before their domestic audiences and international allies. On the evening of October 22, 1962, more than 100 million Americans gathered around television sets to watch President Kennedy address the nation in a 17-minute speech, revealing the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announcing the naval quarantine. Kennedy spoke in measured tones, explaining that Soviet missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads were being prepared to strike American cities, that this required a strong response, and that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union, requiring full retaliatory response. The speech transformed the secret crisis into a public confrontation where both leaders would be judged by how they responded to pressure. In Moscow, Khrushchev recognized that Kennedy had shown restraint by choosing quarantine over immediate military strikes that would have killed Soviet soldiers and triggered escalation to nuclear war. Yet he faced his own difficult choice regarding Soviet ships still crossing the Atlantic carrying more advanced missiles, as he could either continue and test whether Kennedy would use force or order them to turn back in humiliating retreat. On the morning of October 24th, as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line 500 miles from Cuba, where American destroyers waited to intercept them, ExComm members gathered in the cabinet room watching updates on a large board showing the positions of Soviet vessels and American forces. The tension in the room grew unbearable as reports indicated that two Soviet ships, the Gagarin and the Kamils, accompanied by a submarine, were approaching the quarantine line and would reach it within minutes, forcing Kennedy to decide whether to give the order to stop them by force. Then at 10:25 a.m., CIA Director John McCone announced that Soviet ships closest to the quarantine line had stopped in the water, with some appearing to turn around and head back toward the Soviet Union, indicating that Khrushchev had decided to avoid direct confrontation at sea. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, recognizing the significance of the Soviet retreat, turned to National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy and whispered the line that would become famous, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. The Soviet decision to turn back ships carrying additional missiles meant no more nuclear weapons would reach Cuba, representing a tactical victory for Kennedy's quarantine strategy. But the crisis was far from over, as the missiles already in Cuba continued moving toward operational status, and Soviet forces on the island prepared to defend against the American invasion that many believed was inevitable. American military preparations intensified as Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2 for the first time in history, positioning B-52 bombers in continuous airborne alert, with one taking off every 20 minutes, carrying enough nuclear weapons to destroy 4 Soviet cities. The invasion force in Florida grew to 120,000 troops, supported by aircraft carriers and amphibious assault ships. while Florida transformed into a war zone as machine gun positions appeared on beaches and armed soldiers patrolled streets. On the evening of October 26th, Kennedy received an unexpected personal letter from Khrushchev that rambled across multiple topics, but essentially proposed a deal where the Soviet Union would remove missiles from Cuba if the United States ended the quarantine and promised not to invade the island. The letter, which took 12 hours to transmit and appeared to have been written by Khrushchev personally, without consulting advisors, suggested the Soviet leader was searching for a way out of the crisis that would allow both sides to claim success while stepping back from the nuclear brink. ExComm members debated how to respond, as some suspected a trap, while others saw genuine opportunity for resolution. But before they could formulate a reply, Khrushchev sent a second letter on October 27th that raised the stakes by demanding that Kennedy also remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for removing Soviet missiles from Cuba. The new demand complicated negotiations, as the Jupiter missiles, though secretly considered obsolete by American military planners who described them as unreliable and vulnerable, were NATO weapons that Turkey's government opposed removing, and that abandoning would suggest American resolve was weakening under pressure. Kennedy recognized that Khrushchev's proposal was fair, since American missiles in Turkey threatened Soviet cities the same way Soviet missiles in Cuba threatened American cities. But accepting the deal publicly would create the impression that American security commitments to allies could be traded away when Moscow applied pressure, potentially encouraging future Soviet demands and undermining NATO unity. October 27, 1962, became known as Black Saturday as multiple dangerous events converged that brought the crisis to its most perilous moment, when any miscalculation could have triggered nuclear war. The day began with Fidel Castro, convinced that an American invasion was imminent based on the massive military buildup in Florida and intelligence reports of invasion preparations, sending a letter to Khrushchev urging him to consider launching a nuclear first strike against the United States before American forces could land in Cuba. Castro's willingness to accept Cuba's destruction as the price for destroying American cities shocked Khrushchev when he received the letter, demonstrating that the Cuban leader, unlike Kennedy and Khrushchev, who both understood the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war, was prepared to embrace Armageddon rather than accept defeat. At approximately midday on October 27th, American U-2 pilot Major Rudolph Anderson took off from McCoy Air Force Base in Florida on a reconnaissance mission to photograph Soviet missile sites in Cuba and determine how close they were to becoming operational. Anderson, an experienced pilot who had flown some of the first reconnaissance missions that discovered the missiles, entered Cuban airspace and began photographing the San Cristobal area, where medium-range missiles were nearing completion. Soviet air defense crews, operating under standing orders from Moscow not to fire on American aircraft without explicit authorization, nevertheless faced pressure from local commanders who feared that Anderson's photographs would give Americans detailed intelligence needed for surgical airstrikes that could destroy Soviet positions. The Soviet air defense commander in Cuba, without authorization from Moscow, ordered 2 SA-2 surface-to-air missiles fired at Anderson's U-2, with at least one missile detonating close enough that shrapnel tore through the aircraft, killing Anderson instantly and sending his plane plummeting to Earth. Anderson's death, the first and only combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis, created a crisis within the crisis as American military commanders demanded immediate retaliation against Cuban air defenses, while Kennedy and his advisors struggled to determine whether the shootdown represented a deliberate escalation ordered by Khrushchev or a local decision by Soviet officers in Cuba acting without authorization. The president faced enormous pressure to authorize airstrikes that had been planned and prepared, with military leaders arguing that Anderson's death proved Soviet intentions were hostile and that further delay would only give the Soviets time to make more missiles operational, yet Kennedy resisted immediate retaliation, understanding that once American aircraft began bombing Cuba, the momentum toward full-scale war would become unstoppable. While Kennedy debated how to respond to Anderson's death, an even more dangerous confrontation was developing in the waters north of Cuba, where American naval forces had been attempting to locate 4 Soviet submarines that intelligence indicated were operating in the area. The U.S. Navy had developed procedures for forcing submarines to surface by dropping practice depth charges, small explosives that would create loud underwater detonations to signal submarines without causing damage. But Soviet submarine commanders had not been informed of these signaling procedures and interpreted the explosions as attacks. Submarine B-59, which had been submerged for days trying to evade American destroyers while enduring temperatures above 120 degrees and carbon dioxide levels that caused crew members to faint, found itself surrounded by American ships dropping depth charges that created deafening explosions that shook the submarine. The captain of B-59, Valentin Savitsky, exhausted from days of evasion and unable to communicate with Moscow to determine if war had begun, concluded that American forces were attacking with lethal intent and that he must respond with the submarine's nuclear-tipped torpedo that could destroy the American ships hunting him. Soviet regulations required agreement from 3 officers to launch nuclear weapons, with Savitsky and the submarine's political officer both agreeing to launch, while the 3rd officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused despite pressure from Savitsky, who was his superior in rank. Arkhipov, who had survived a nuclear reactor accident on another submarine the previous year and understood the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons, insisted they must surface and await orders from Moscow rather than launching a weapon that would almost certainly trigger nuclear war. After heated argument, Savitsky accepted Arkhipov's position and ordered the submarine to surface, where American ships surrounded it but allowed it to leave once Soviet officers agreed to leave Cuban waters. The incident, which remained secret for decades until Soviet naval records were declassified in the 1990s, represented the closest moment to nuclear war during the crisis, as the launch of B-59's nuclear torpedo would have destroyed American destroyers and almost certainly triggered retaliatory strikes against Soviet forces that would have escalated within hours to strategic nuclear exchange. Arkhipov's refusal to authorize the launch, made in conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty when he could not know whether his caution or his captain's aggression represented the correct response, prevented nuclear war through a decision that neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev knew had been necessary. As Black Saturday ended on October 27th, Kennedy and his advisors faced the reality that time for negotiation was running out, with military commanders demanding authorization for airstrikes by Monday morning, October 29th at the latest, and with Anderson's death having increased pressure for immediate retaliation. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and closest advisor, worked with speechwriter Ted Sorensen to craft a response to Khrushchev that ignored the second Soviet letter demanding removal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey and instead replied only to the first letter, proposing that Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba in exchange for an American non-invasion pledge. The response, delivered to Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin on the evening of October 27th, included a secret additional message that the United States would remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey within months after the Cuban crisis was resolved, but that this removal must appear to be an independent American decision rather than a concession extracted by Soviet pressure. Kennedy's proposal gave Khrushchev a way to claim success by arguing that Soviet missiles had achieved their purpose of protecting Cuba from American invasion, while the secret Turkish missile removal gave Khrushchev substantive gain that would restore Soviet security without appearing to be a public retreat. The Soviet leader, who had spent October 27th receiving increasingly alarming reports from Cuba, including Castro's letter advocating nuclear first strike and news that a U-2 had been shot down, recognized that events were spiraling toward war and that he needed to accept Kennedy's offer before the president lost control of his military commanders. On the morning of October 28th, Khrushchev broadcast a message over Radio Moscow, bypassing slow diplomatic channels, announcing that he had ordered Soviet missiles in Cuba to be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba, bringing the 13-day crisis to an end. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis prevented nuclear war through restraint, secret diplomacy, and luck, as both Kennedy and Khrushchev recognized that avoiding catastrophe mattered more than winning. While events like Anderson's shootdown and the B-59 submarine incident demonstrated how easily miscalculation could have triggered escalation, the crisis convinced both superpowers that communication needed improvement, leading to installation of the hotline, direct link between the White House and Kremlin, and pursuit of arms control agreements, including the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Kennedy's reputation was enhanced by achieving Soviet missile removal while avoiding war, though the secret Turkish missile concession remained hidden for years. Khrushchev faced criticism from Soviet hardliners who saw the withdrawal as humiliating retreat, contributing to his removal from power in 1964. Castro felt betrayed that decisions affecting Cuba were made without consulting him, leading to lasting resentment toward the Soviet Union. The crisis demonstrated that nuclear weapons had made traditional victory meaningless, as any nuclear exchange would destroy both sides regardless of who fired first, forcing leaders to recognize that the only way to win was not to play. The 13 days showed how quickly events could spiral toward catastrophe, how difficult controlling escalation becomes when military forces are on high alert, and how easily unauthorized actions by individuals could trigger consequences no leader intended. The world had come closer to annihilation than most realized, with Arkipov's decision and Kennedy's restraint representing moments when different choices would have led to war. The crisis established the pattern that would govern Cold War confrontations for 3 decades, where both superpowers recognized that direct military conflict was too dangerous, but neither could appear weak, leading to careful balance of competition and cooperation that avoided war while maintaining ideological struggle. The world's closest call with Armageddon ended not through superior force, but through recognition by leaders on both sides that some competitions were too dangerous to win, and that survival required compromise even when victory seemed within reach. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.